The man history remembers as Idi Amin was born under murky circumstances in Uganda during the mid-1920s. Some accounts, including one by his son Hussein, suggest he was born as late as 1928. However, the most likely years of his birth are 1923 or 1924. His birthplace is equally debated, with some claiming he was born in Kampala, Uganda's capital. But that's unlikely. Amin was probably born in Koboko, a Muslim-majority region near what is now the South Sudan border. Amin's father's story is similarly unclear. Andreas Nyabayer, reportedly a member of the Kakwa people, converted to Islam from Roman Catholicism in the early 1900s and adopted the name Amin Dada. Other accounts paint a different picture, suggesting he was Nubian, possibly raised as a Muslim, and linked to Sudanese communities brought south by Emin Pasha, an Ottoman governor in the late 19th century. Amin's mother, Asa, may have been Kakwa or Lugbara, northern Ugandan ethnic groups. What we do know is that his father left the family when Amin was young, leaving him to be raised solely by his mother. Amin attended an Islamic school in Bombo during the 1940s, a time when World War II was raging across nearby regions like Italian East Africa and the Maghreb. To understand Amin's rise, we must first explore Uganda's colonial past, a land shaped more by the imaginations of its colonizers than by any natural unity. Before colonial rule, Uganda was a patchwork of ethnicities, with the Baganda people dominating the south, while Nilotic groups like the Kakwa and Lugbara lived in the north. Religious diversity further complicated matters. Islam had spread to the north, while Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, and indigenous religions were prominent elsewhere. When the British arrived in the late 19th century, they established the Uganda Protectorate in 1894, partly driven by their ambition to control a stretch of Africa from Cairo to Cape Town. British rule exploited Uganda's resources but also brought infrastructure, cash crops like sugar and cotton, and higher literacy rates. However, colonial governance exacerbated divisions by favoring Protestant Baganda elites over northern Muslims. The British also trained the Ugandan military, which became crucial during World War I. Amin, however, falsely claimed he joined the British Army during World War II and fought in Burma. His real military career began with the King's African Rifles, KR, in the late 1940s. His physical prowess and charisma earned him rapid promotions, unusual for Africans under British command. By the 1950s, Amin was in Kenya during the Mau Mau Uprising, a violent revolt against British rule. While Amin served with distinction, he later downplayed his role in what was essentially a defense of colonialism. In the 1960s, as decolonization swept Africa, Uganda gained independence in 1962. Yet unlike other African nations with strong independence movements, Uganda lacked a mature political structure. Three major political parties emerged: the Democratic Party, Catholic-focused, the Uganda People's Congress, UPC, representing northern Nilotic groups, and Kabaka Yeka, a Ugandan nationalist party. Milton Obote, leader of the UPC, became Uganda's first prime minister, but his tenure was plagued by ethnic and political tensions. Amin rose quickly in the post-independence Ugandan military, becoming army commander by 1970. However, his ascent was intertwined with corruption, including aiding Obote in smuggling gold and ivory from the Congo. This corruption, discovered in 1966, prompted Obote to seize absolute power, sidelining Amin. By the late 1960s, Amin was consolidating his own power, recruiting soldiers from his Kakwa and Nubian ethnic groups to secure his military control. He also courted support from Britain and Israel, who had vested interests in Uganda due to Cold War politics and regional security concerns. The tipping point came in January 1971 when Obote, suspicious of Amin, attempted to strip him of his command. While Obote attended a Commonwealth meeting in Singapore, Amin launched a coup, swiftly taking control of Kampala and other key points. Claiming to restore democracy, Amin promised a temporary government. Instead, he ruled with an iron fist for 8 brutal years. Idi Amin wasted no time consolidating his power after the near-bloodless coup of January 1971. By February 2, he had declared himself president and retained his role as commander of the Ugandan armed forces. Under his rule, the government quickly transformed into a military dictatorship, with any promises to uphold the constitution or legal system fading almost instantly. Military tribunals replaced civilian courts, and Amin's loyalists, many unqualified, were handed key political and civil positions. He ruled by decree and renamed the government headquarters in Kampala as the command post. To tighten his grip on power, Amin carried out sweeping purges of both the military and civilian sectors. Thousands of individuals were not just removed from their posts but often executed. These purges marked the beginning of the mass killings that would define his regime in the 1970s. Amin's coup didn't go unchallenged. The ousted president, Milton Obote, found refuge in Tanzania, where President Julius Nyerere supported him and refused to recognize Amin's government. Tanzania also became a sanctuary for over 20,000 Ugandan refugees, many of whom began plotting Amin's downfall. Among these exiles was a young Yoweri Museveni, a name that would later become central to Uganda's history. In September 1972, a group of 1,500 guerrilla fighters launched an invasion from Tanzania, aiming to overthrow Amin. However, the mission was a disaster. Amin, forewarned, crushed the invasion within days, killing hundreds of fighters. Despite this failure, the event highlighted Tanzania's role in the growing resistance against Amin. Initially, Amin's regime was warmly embraced by the international community. Both Britain and Israel supported his 1971 coup, believing Amin to be a more cooperative leader than Obote. In July of that year, Amin made state visits to both nations, charming his hosts with promises of unity for Uganda's diverse ethnic and religious groups. He even visited Scotland, a place he had a deep fondness for, having trained there in the 1950s. He later dressed some Ugandan soldiers in Scottish kilts and gave his sons Scottish names. During these visits, Amin sought weapons for a potential conflict with Tanzania, but both Britain and Israel declined his requests. Back in Uganda, signs of Amin's true nature emerged. Two American researchers investigating early political killings, Nicholas Stroh and Robert Seidel, were murdered at Mbarara Army Barracks in July 1971. The incident sparked international concern, and an American investigator fled the country before completing his inquiry, fearing for his own safety. It became evident that Amin was not the strongman the West had hoped for but a volatile dictator. Rebuffed by Britain and Israel, Amin turned to Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. During his visit to Libya, Amin portrayed himself as a devout Muslim and exaggerated Uganda's Muslim population, claiming it was 70% when it was closer to 6%. Gaddafi, convinced by Amin's claims, provided weapons and brought Uganda into the Organization of Islamic States. In return, Amin promised to curb Christian religious freedoms in Uganda. Meanwhile, the violence in Uganda escalated. By early 1972, Amin targeted the Akoli and Lango ethnic groups, killing thousands, including soldiers, lawyers, students, and religious leaders. Many bodies were dumped in the Nile. Though the Western media largely remained unaware of the atrocities, reports of unrest began to leak out, particularly after clashes spilled into Tanzanian territory. In August 1972, Amin issued an order that shocked the world. He demanded that all Asians without Ugandan citizenship, many of whom had lived in Uganda for generations, leave the country within 90 days. Asians had long dominated Uganda's trade and industry, controlling 80 to 90% of the economy. Amin's decision aimed to transfer economic power to ethnic Ugandans. The British government, bound by an earlier promise of citizenship for Asians in its former colonies, faced a refugee crisis. As the deadline approached, a United Nations airlift evacuated 27,000 Asians to Britain, though thousands more were left in limbo. By the end of 1972, Amin's regime had already left tens of thousands dead or displaced, with political and religious persecution intensifying. The worst, however, was yet to come. Amin's paranoia became more pronounced as the years went on. He would often act unpredictably, making decisions that baffled even those closest to him. His government meetings were marked by erratic behavior, and he would sometimes accuse senior officials of plotting against him without evidence. Executions of ministers and military officers became a regular occurrence, further consolidating his rule through fear. One of Amin's most infamous moments of paranoia came when he ordered the massacre of several members of the Ugandan military, believing they were conspiring to overthrow him. These purges not only weakened the army but also sowed deep divisions within its ranks, making the military less capable of defending Uganda from external threats. This would prove catastrophic in the years ahead. On the international stage, Amin's actions continued to alienate former allies and attract widespread condemnation. His rhetoric became increasingly inflammatory, and he frequently insulted world leaders in public speeches. For instance, he sent a telegram to Queen Elizabeth II, mocking her and offering himself as her replacement as the head of the Commonwealth. He also declared himself conqueror of the British Empire, despite Britain's dwindling involvement in Ugandan affairs. Relations with neighboring countries also deteriorated. His ongoing feud with Tanzania's President Julius Nyerere escalated, as Amin continued to accuse Tanzania of harboring Ugandan exiles plotting to overthrow him. In 1978, tensions boiled over when Amin launched a military invasion of Tanzania, ostensibly to annex the Kagera salient, a strip of land near the border. This reckless move would mark the beginning of his downfall. The invasion of Tanzania in October 1978 was a disastrous miscalculation. Amin's forces, though large in number, were poorly trained and ill-equipped, especially after years of internal purges that weakened the military leadership. Tanzanian forces, on the other hand, were disciplined and well-organized. They also had the support of Ugandan exiles, including future President Yoweri Museveni, who had been preparing for this moment for years. Within months, Tanzanian forces launched a counteroffensive, pushing Amin's troops back into Uganda. By early 1979, Tanzanian and Ugandan rebel forces had captured key towns and were closing in on Kampala. Amin, realizing that his regime was crumbling, fled the capital on April 11, 1979, as Tanzanian troops entered the city. The fall of Kampala marked the end of Amin's 8-year reign of terror. Amin fled first to Libya, where his former ally Muammar Gaddafi granted him temporary asylum. However, his welcome there was short-lived, and he eventually settled in Saudi Arabia, where he lived in exile until his death in 2003. Despite his ouster, Amin remained defiant to the end, never expressing remorse for the atrocities committed under his rule. His legacy in Uganda is one of devastation. By the time Amin was overthrown, the country's economy was in ruins, its infrastructure had collapsed, and tens of thousands of people had been killed or displaced. The scars of his dictatorship are still felt in Uganda today, as the country continues to rebuild from the chaos of his regime. An issue that seems to have greatly influenced Idi Amin's personality and actions as ruler of Uganda was his contraction of syphilis during his younger years. By the 1970s, it is believed he may have been suffering from partial dementia caused by tertiary syphilis. This could explain some of his bizarre behavior and the accusations of cannibalism that emerged toward the end of his dictatorship. In the late 1970s, an Israeli doctor who had worked in Uganda publicly stated, "It's no secret that Amin is suffering from the advanced stages of syphilis, which has caused brain damage." This might also account for Amin's peculiar telegram to Kurt Waldheim, the Secretary General of the United Nations at the time, in which he praised Adolf Hitler and appeared to suggest that the Holocaust involved burning people with gas. Word of the message spread quickly among world leaders, cementing Amin's reputation as a partial madman. His remarks praising Nazi actions during World War II even strained his relations with the Soviet Union, one of his few remaining backers. In 1976, one of the most infamous events of Amin's regime occurred. On June 27, an Air France plane flying from Tel Aviv to Paris via Athens was hijacked and diverted to Entebbe airport near Kampala. It soon became clear that Amin was colluding with Palestinian terrorists and members of the West German urban guerrilla group, Revolutionär Zelen, who orchestrated the hijacking. Non-Jewish passengers were released, while Jewish hostages were held as the hijackers demanded the release of dozens of Palestinian prisoners in Israel. The ordeal culminated in a dramatic rescue operation on July 4, when Israeli commandos stormed Entebbe airport. They freed nearly all the hostages, destroyed much of Uganda's air force, and returned to Israel in a daring mission that lasted just 90 minutes. Amin was enraged and humiliated by the operation. This incident was one of many incendiary actions that defined Amin's regime in the late 1970s. Relations with neighboring Kenya were also damaged. Amin revived a baseless claim that parts of western Kenya belonged to Uganda, further alienating the Kenyan government, which had supported the Israeli rescue mission. In retaliation, Amin had hundreds, possibly thousands, of ethnic Kenyans living in Uganda killed. Religious tensions also grew under Amin. He favored Muslims and suppressed Christian communities, leading to widespread dissent. Archbishop Janani Luwum of the Church of Uganda became a vocal critic of Amin, calling for unity between religious groups. In 1977, Amin had Luwum arrested on fabricated charges. The archbishop was later murdered, with reports suggesting Amin himself may have pulled the trigger. Dissent also spread within Amin's government. High-profile defections, such as those of Finance Minister Emmanuel Blayo Wakwaya and Health Minister Henry Kayemba, who later wrote a damning exposé titled A State of Blood, further weakened Amin's grip on power. By late 1977, cracks in Amin's military support were evident. A split emerged between those loyal to him and those backing Vice President Mustafa Adrisi. This division played a role in Amin's ill-fated decision to invade Tanzania in 1978, a move intended to consolidate his control. Initially, Ugandan forces advanced into northern Tanzania, but in early 1979, Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere launched a counteroffensive with the support of Ugandan exiles. The war culminated in March 1979 at the Battle of Lukaya, where Tanzanian forces and Ugandan rebels defeated Amin's troops and their Libyan allies. As Tanzanian forces advanced on Kampala, Amin's regime collapsed. On April 11, 1979, Amin fled the capital by helicopter, marking the end of his 8-year rule. In the aftermath, Uganda struggled to regain stability. A fractured civilian government gave way to another military coup in May 1980. Elections later that year saw Milton Obote return to power, beginning a new chapter in Uganda's history. Milton Obote's return to power in the 1980 elections was marred by controversy. Many believed the election was rigged in favor of Obote's Uganda People's Congress, UPC. As Obote assumed office for a second term, a new guerrilla war erupted between his government and those who refused to recognize its legitimacy. This conflict, known as the Ugandan Bush War, was fought for over 5 years between Obote's forces and the National Resistance Movement, NRM, led by Yoweri Museveni. The war eventually tilted in favor of the NRM, and by 1985, Obote was forced to flee the country. In January 1986, Museveni's guerrilla forces captured Kampala, and Museveni became the new president of Uganda. Despite Museveni's victory, Uganda was not immediately at peace. Museveni's regime was deeply criticized for human rights abuses and persecution of minorities, and he became one of the longest-serving heads of state in the world, having been re-elected in 2021. While the Ugandan Bush War was a 1980s conflict, it did not involve the infamous Idi Amin, whose brutal dictatorship was largely confined to the 1970s. The true scale of the devastation caused by Amin's regime is difficult to determine. With an ill-defined population at the time and the chaotic nature of Amin's rule, many of the killings went unrecorded. However, estimates suggest that at least 300,000 people died due to his policies, with some census records pointing to a population decline of between 420,000 and 800,000. Amin's military regime was notorious for its cruelty. Senior army officials were granted the power to kill people with impunity, and the economic mismanagement exacerbated the suffering. His reign is considered one of the most brutal in Africa during the 1970s. After Amin was ousted from power in 1979, he initially fled to Libya, where he was given refuge by his ally, Muammar Gaddafi. In 1980, Amin relocated to Saudi Arabia, where he lived in exile until his death. Despite claims that many Ugandans wanted him restored to power, Amin never returned to Uganda. In 1989, he tried to capitalize on regional instability in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, to build a support base for his return to Uganda, but his attempt failed, and he returned to Saudi Arabia. In his later years, Amin led a relatively quiet life in Jeddah, engaging in sports, gym sessions, and occasional shopping trips. However, his exile was not without controversy. Although he was never tried in an international court for war crimes, calls for his prosecution were limited. In 2003, at the age of 80, Amin was reported to be in a coma due to kidney failure, and when his life support was turned off on August 16, 2003, he passed away. He was buried in a simple grave in Saudi Arabia. Amin's legacy is that of a ruthless dictator who used political oppression and ethnic divisions to maintain power. His regime was marked by excessive violence, including massacres and disappearances. He created a military state where the army had absolute control, and many died not from direct government orders, but because of the unchecked power of the military. Amin's reign was also marked by a series of mismanaged economic policies, which further impoverished the population. As his rule became more unpopular, he resorted to regional conflicts, such as the ill-fated war with Tanzania in 1978, which eventually led to his downfall. Amin's rise to power is also a grim reminder of the failures of decolonization. He was trained by the British and rose through the ranks of the King's African Rifles. Despite committing atrocities before Uganda's independence, he was never court-martialed due to political considerations. Later, both the British and Israeli governments supported his coup against Milton Obote in 1971, furthering their geopolitical interests, which allowed Amin to come to power. Amin's rise and reign exemplify the challenges faced by post-independence African nations. The legacy of colonialism, combined with Cold War politics, facilitated the rise of dictators like Amin. The global powers, both during the Cold War and in the years after, often prioritized their own interests over the well-being of African nations, which contributed to the support of brutal regimes. Amin's fall from power in 1979 ended one of the most brutal dictatorships in Africa, but his actions continued to shape Uganda and the surrounding region. His regime destabilized the East African region, and his influence lingered even after he was ousted. Amin's rise to power, his reign of terror, and his eventual fall from grace serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of authoritarian rule and the failures of global powers to address the consequences of such regimes. While Uganda has since moved on from Amin's era, the scars of his brutal dictatorship remain deeply embedded in the country's history. What do you think of Idi Amin? Do you believe he was one of the most vicious dictators of post-independence Africa? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.